The village of Zuberi had always been peaceful, nestled between vast forests and rolling hills. The people believed in the wisdom of the elders, the power of their ancestors, and the delicate balance between life and death. But one night, that balance was broken. Naima, a young woman known for her kindness and beauty, went into labor under the full moon. Her husband, Omari, and the village midwife, Mama Fatuma, stayed by her side as she screamed in pain. The labor lasted hours, and by the time the first cries of the newborn filled the air, exhaustion had drained every ounce of Naima's strength. But when Mama Fatuma looked at the child, her hands trembled. The baby's eyes were wide open, unblinking. The midwife hesitated, waiting for the newborn to squint, to flinch, to show any sign of normalcy. But the child only stared. His eyes were dark, endless, like the night sky before a storm. Mama Fatuma swallowed hard. Naima, your son does not blink. At first, the village rejoiced. A child had been born, and every birth was a blessing. But as the days passed, the whispers began. Have you seen the boy? He never blinks. The ancestors do not recognize him. Naima ignored them. She loved her son, whom she named Baraka, meaning blessing. She refused to believe he was anything but a gift. He is special, she told Omari, rocking the baby in her arms. His eyes are always open because he wants to see the world. But Omari wasn't so sure. Something about their son unsettled him. Then, the first death happened. Old Baba Juma, the village storyteller, was the first to go. He had been seen talking to Naima, leaning over the baby's cradle, muttering curses. That same night, he was found dead in his hut, his eyes wide open, frozen in fear. And Baraka? He still hadn't blinked. The villagers whispered behind Naima's back, their voices barely above the wind, but she could hear them. She saw the way their eyes followed her, filled with something darker than suspicion, fear. They avoided her now, stepping off the road when she walked past with Baraka in her arms. Even Omari had changed. At night, he lay further away from her, his body tense, his breath uneasy. He did not say it aloud, but Naima could feel it, the growing space between them, the silent dread curling around him like smoke. He loved her, she knew that, but fear had begun to gnaw at him, pulling him further away with every passing day. Then, another death. A young boy named Sefu had been playing near Naima's home. He had always been a curious child, with big, eager eyes that loved to explore. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he peeked through the open window of Naima's hut, hoping to get a glimpse of Baraka. The next morning, his mother found him lifeless in his bed. His face was twisted in silent terror. His eyes, wide, staring, were still open. The village erupted into chaos. The boy is cursed, someone cried. No child should be born without blinking, another added, clutching her charms close. Naima held Baraka tighter, shielding him from the hateful stares. He is just a baby, she whispered, but her words held no power against their growing fear. That was when the elders stepped in. The village gathered in the square beneath the great baobab tree. The air was thick with tension, the smell of burning torches clinging to the wind. Chief Jabari stood before them, his face heavy with sorrow. The boy must be taken away, he declared. His voice was not cruel, but it was firm. He is not one of us. A stunned silence followed. Then, Naima's scream shattered the night. You will not take my son. She clutched Baraka to her chest as if the mere force of her love could shield him. Tears streamed down her face, hot and furious. He is a child, not a demon, she sobbed. But the elders had already made up their minds. Mothers clutched their children. Men avoided Naima's gaze. Even those who had once been her friends refused to meet her eyes. Baraka had become a threat. That night, in the darkness of their small hut, Omari held Naima close, pressing his forehead against hers. His voice was barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. "We must leave." Naima's breath hitched. "Omari, no, it is the only way," he said, his voice breaking. "If we stay, they will take him. Or worse." Naima looked down at her son. His large, unblinking eyes stared up at her, calm, knowing. Somewhere in the night, a distant drum sounded. Naima swallowed hard. Tomorrow, before the village could wake, they would run. And they would never look back. With only the moon as their witness, Naima, Omari, and little Baraka fled from Zuberi. They didn't look back. The whispers of the villagers still echoed in Naima's mind, the weight of their fear pressing against her chest. Omari led the way, his grip tight around Naima's hand as they walked deeper into the forest. The trees stood tall and silent, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Every step felt heavier than the last, but they couldn't stop. The village was no longer their home. Baraka, wrapped securely against Naima's chest, remained quiet. His large, unblinking eyes gazed up at the night sky, reflecting the soft glow of the moon. He did not cry, did not fuss. He only watched. They walked for hours, the dense foliage swallowing them whole. The further they went, the less the village felt real. The huts, the elders, the accusations, they all melted into the shadows behind them, becoming nothing more than a fading memory. For the first time in weeks, Naima exhaled a breath of relief. Maybe here, in the silence of the wild, they could live in peace. Maybe Baraka could grow up without fear. The thought brought her comfort, but deep in her heart, an unease still lingered. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Omari finally stopped when they reached a clearing near a small river. "We will rest here," he said, his voice low and tired. Naima nodded, lowering herself onto the cool grass. She gently unwrapped Baraka, cradling him in her arms. The baby stared up at her, unblinking as ever. She traced a finger across his tiny cheek. "You are safe now, my love," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Omari built a small fire, its orange glow flickering against the darkness. He sat beside Naima, pulling her close. "We will start fresh," he murmured. "We will build a new home where no one can harm him." Naima closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth of her husband's embrace. Maybe, just maybe, they had escaped the nightmare. Then, in the middle of the night, Naima woke. Something was wrong. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the trees. The air was thick, the silence pressing against her ears like a weight. And then she heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely more than a breath against the wind. But then it came again. Soft. Lingering. Coming from the trees. Naima's body stiffened. She turned her head slowly, heart pounding. The branches swayed lightly, though there was no wind. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the forest floor. Another whisper. Closer this time. A low, murmuring voice, like someone speaking just beyond her understanding. She reached for Omari, shaking his shoulder. "Omari, wake up," she hissed. Omari groaned, half asleep. "What is it?" Naima's lips parted, but she couldn't find the words. Because as she looked past the dying fire, she saw them. Figures standing between the trees. Watching. Waiting. And Baraka, still in her arms, was staring right back at them. Unblinking. Then she heard it again. The whispering. A rustling in the leaves. A shift in the air. She held her son tighter. "Who's there?" she called out. Silence. Then, a voice. "He is ours." Na'ima's blood ran cold. The trees shuddered, though there was no wind. She woke Omari in a panic. "We are not alone," she whispered. Omari's eyes darted around. The night was thick with darkness, but something was moving just beyond their sight. And then, they saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Watching. Never blinking. The figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely human. Their faces were gaunt, their skin stretched too tightly over their bones. But their eyes were just like Baraka's. Wide. Dark. Unblinking. Na'ima clutched her son, heart hammering in her chest. "What do you want?" One of the figures stepped forward. "He belongs with us." Omari moved in front of Na'ima, his voice shaking. "He is our son." The figure tilted its head. "No. He is one of the Watchers." Na'ima gasped. The Watchers, ancient beings who never slept, never rested. It was said they guarded the thin veil between life and death. And her son was one of them. The Watchers reached out their hands. "He must come with us." Their voices were like wine through hollow bones, soft yet filled with something ancient and unshakable. The air around them rippled, thick with unseen energy. The trees trembled as if holding their breath. Na'ima clutched Baraka tighter against her chest, her heart beat loud in her ears. "No," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "He is just a child." The Watchers did not move forward, but their presence pressed against her, suffocating. Their forms were shadowed, shifting like smoke, neither fully solid nor fully air. They had no faces, only empty voids where eyes should be. And yet, Na'ima felt their gaze piercing through her soul. Omari stepped in front of her, fists clenched, though his hands shook. "You cannot take him," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "He is our son." A silence fell. Then, the tallest of the Watchers spoke. "He was never yours to keep." The wind howled through the clearing, swirling dust around them. The fire flickered wildly before vanishing completely, leaving only darkness. Na'ima's throat tightened. "You're wrong," she choked out. "He is mine. I carried him, birthed him, loved him, he belongs to the unseen," the Watchers whispered in unison. "He is one of us." The words hit like a dagger to her chest. No. No, it wasn't true. He was her baby, her little boy. She had cradled him on sleepless nights, sang to him beneath the moon. How could they say he was not hers? Tears burned Na'ima's eyes. "He is not one of you," she pleaded. "He is only a child." Omari turned to her, his eyes filled with desperation. "We can't fight them, Na'ima." His voice broke. "They are not of this world." But how could she just let them take her son? Baraka remained silent in her arms, his tiny face calm, his ever-watching eyes locked onto the figures before them. He did not cry, did not squirm. He simply stared. The air grew heavier, pressing against her lungs. The Watchers were waiting. They would not leave without him. "No," Na'ima whispered, shaking her head. "Please." The Watchers did not respond. Baraka shifted in her arms. Then, slowly, he reached out a small hand and touched her face. A warmth spread through her skin where his fingers rested. The moment stretched, suspended in time. And then, for the first time in his life, Baraka blinked. A single, slow blink. Na'ima's breath caught in her throat. And before she could cry out, he vanished. Her arms, once filled with his warmth, were now empty. The Watchers were gone. The forest fell silent. Naima collapsed to her knees, a scream lodged in her throat, but no sound came out. Omari dropped beside her, his hands shaking as they grasped at the empty air where their son had been. Baraka, he whispered, his voice raw with grief. But there was no answer. Only the cold wind, whispering through the trees. Naima and Omari returned to Zuberi, empty-handed. The villagers, seeing their broken spirits, knew what had happened. The elders said nothing. The curse had been lifted. But Naima knew the truth. Baraka was not cursed. He was chosen. And somewhere, beyond the veil of life and death, he was still watching. Years passed. Naima and Omari never had another child. But every so often, Naima would wake in the night, feeling something watching. One evening, a young woman in the village gave birth to a son. The midwife screamed in terror. The child's eyes were wide. And he did not blink.